it is a complete pleasure to be here and, of course, an enormous honor to be here. I hope I can handle the technology, which shouldn't be too difficult, but you never know. It was very moving to go to see the gravestone of Michael Ivanovich and Sophie Rostovtsev. Very simple, very clean, very humble. Nothing says that this is the gravestone of one of the leading thinkers of the 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd century. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on this because otherwise I get so nervous I can't talk anymore. It is a great honor being here. The African cities of Carthage, Utica, Hadramawt, and the other towns were not only large centers of commerce, but each of them exploited in an efficient manner the large and fertile territory which they gradually occupied. Olive oil, fruit, and to a certain extent wine were the main products of these cities. The African coast was a vast and beautiful garden. Unfortunately, however, like other gardens before and after, the beautiful gardens of Africa also contained serpents, ready to lure the inhabitants and lead them astray. Thus, grasping aristocrats amassed vast expanses of arable land, strangled the prosperous bourgeoisie of the cities, and impoverished the peasants. Over time, this led to a revolt that spread from Africa to the entire empire and was brought to an end only through the unholy alliance between a new militarized elite and imperial strongmen who brought the empire under control through a system of taxation that was more or less organized robbery. Peace was thus purchased at the expense of liberty. In a manner of speaking, everyone became a slave. The great landed proprietors were slaves of the emperor, but masters of this colony, tenant slaves, who lived on their estates, now caught in hereditary enslavement to the soil. Neither they nor their children could ever escape. Of course, the petty bourgeoisie of the early empire was ruined and degraded. In other words, the social revolution of the 3rd century destroyed the foundations of the economic, social, and intellectual life of the ancient world. Written in the mid-20s, 1920s, Mikhail Ivanovich Rostovtsev words describing the beginning of Rome's end continue to haunt. The Garden of Eden, made bountiful and prosperous through the efficient enterprise of free citizens, the bourgeoisie, engaged in commerce, was Roman Africa, but also Russia before the revolution. And what had been so utterly destroyed that it could not produce anything of achievement was Rostovtsev's home, his paradise, now irretrievably lost. It was Russia's fate that he sought to comprehend through the thorough investigation of the social and economic conditions, without which no attempts to write a general history of the Roman Empire can be successful. Thus, Rome's story became that of man's expulsion from paradise, told through taxation, enslavement of peasants to the land, and the evisceration of the free citizens, the bourgeoisie. That Michael Rostovtsev chose to tell the story of paradise lost through social and economic history may come as a surprise. But accounts of man's expulsion from Eden are always also narratives of dystopia and utopia. The causes and consequences of man's fall from grace are heuristic tools to analyze present society, in contrast to what might once have been and might eventually be found again. An ideal city with just obligations, fair taxes, and no death. Rostovtsev's social and economic history of the Roman Empire is thus also a tale of two cities, the Civitas Terrena and the Civitas Dei. And he was not alone in using Roman North Africa and the language of economy and taxation to talk about man's expulsion from paradise and its consequences. However, while Rostovtsev moved from the description of the actual enslavement of the later Romans to a metaphorical fall from grace, the other man who wrote about two cities, Augustine, did something a little different. He moved from actual slavery to the literal expulsion from paradise, which for him was a historical event. Let me explain what I mean. Okay. In 427 or 428, Augustine, Bishop of Hippo Regius in northern North Africa, wrote a letter to his friend Alypius, Bishop of Thagaste, who was then in Rome en route to Ravenna, where the Roman emperors resided. Augustine wrote to inform Alypius of recent events he considered so grave that they warranted imperial intervention. A band of slave traders and their catchers had rounded up men, women, and children, free Roman citizens, to sell them overseas as slaves. At the time, Augustine had been away, only to find upon his return that members of his church had freed at least 120 of these captives. Many still lived in the episcopal precinct at Hippo. For Augustine, these actions and their consequences called for a change of existing law, and that was the purpose of his letter. Alypius was the right man to lobby the imperial court for such a change. He and Augustine had gone from North Africa to Rome and Milan together to practice forensic rhetoric, and Alypius went on to become assessor to the court of the imperial fiscus, a highly prestigious legal position. Since they returned to North Africa in the 380s, both men together had successfully lobbied for several imperial laws and rescripts. Hence, Augustine's confidence in Alypius' powers to sway the imperial court at Ravenna was well placed. Sending a letter to Alypius was, however, not Augustine's only action. He wrote a second letter to another legal expert closer to home, a legal consultant called Eustochius. Such consultants are usually charged just before a case was officially pleaded to examine all the facts at issue in light of the available jurisprudence and imperial legislation, jus et leges. The legal questions Augustine presented to that consultant are the same as those he raised in the letter to Alypius, so that both letters form a dossier. They suggest that Augustine was preparing at least one, probably two legal cases, both as advocate in his own defense and as a judge in a related case. In short, these matters were serious. The letters in question are number 10 and 24 of the so-called Divchak letters, newly discovered in the 1980s. Since the discovery, letter 10, concerning the slave trade, has garnered a significant amount of scholarly attention. Nearly every recent work on late Roman North Africa, the late Roman economy, slavery in antiquity and late antiquity, the evolution of the law in the later Roman Empire, or on Augustine as bishop and administrator cites this letter for good reason. Augustine's description of the collusion between slave traders, their catchers, and well-situated patrons in dragging men, women, and children across the Roman Empire in columns like an endless river, perpetual quasi fluvio, is the most detailed account we possess of the mechanisms of the slave trade in the Roman Empire. While scattered evidence of papyri, inscriptions, legal and literary sources attest to the transport of slaves bought and kidnapped across the empire, no other source is as detailed in describing the organization of that particular trade. This fact alone alerts us to the importance of this letter. Two main reasons account for the paucity of information about the ancient slave trade. The first is the utter disdain with which our elite ancient authors regarded those who traded in a merchandise they ravenously consumed and from which they profited but did not write about. The second is an interesting collusion in modern historiography regarding slavery in the late Roman Empire. Because that empire was, by 427 and 428, largely governed by Christians, scholars interested in Christian authors have in general assumed an ameliorating effect on slavery leading to its decrease. For others, beginning with Karl Marx and Max Weber, and continuing with scholars such as Michael Rostovtsev, and Moses Finley. The period signifies the change from a slave-owning society to its feudal successor, also characterized by a decrease in slavery and the rise of the so-called colonate. The specifics of that transition are one of the most central historiographic debates regarding the later Roman Empire on its way to post-Roman kingdoms. The famous scholarly positions continue to be contested and refined. As a consequence of these debates, however, work on late antique slavery for its own sake is of recent vintage. We're talking 2010, 11, 12, 13. Further, there remains a divide between scholars engaged in the economic, social, and legal realities of late Roman slavery and other forms of bondage, that is, historians, and those engaged in the theoretical positions about absolute divine grace, free will, and enslavement to sin, that is, theologians. Letters 10 and 24 fall right into the middle of this divide and address every one of the central issues at stake. They reveal that Augustine of Hippo engaged in the same set of questions, human freedom and bondage, at the same time, from a legal, administrative, economic, pastoral, and theological perspective. These are truly remarkable documents and deserve every citation they get. They also deserve to be read, however, something that has happened surprisingly rarely in the detail required. They're not the only texts like that. Hence, there are plenty more dissertations that can be written. Scholars have discussed letter 10 as a straightforward description of an appalling incident, the illegal capture for sale of free Romans. That reveals Augustine's wish to come to the aid of those in need, but also shows his judicial role as bishop, his weak position as administrator, powerless against local heavyweights, and the purported decline of the Roman Empire's hold on North Africa. Indeed, while these rivers of slaves flowed through Hippo Regius, the Vandals were moving south through Spain toward Gibraltar. In fact, letter 10 is a commonitorium or memorandum rather than a letter, and this is an important distinction. While letters were then written for immediate publication, just like Facebook now, a commonitorium was strictly private, an exchange between high officials, often addressing difficult and delicate matters, including confidential legal strategies and tactics. In this memorandum, Augustine planned how Alypius should compel the imperial court to act, down to suggesting official formulations. Far from providing a straightforward account, Augustine presented Alypius with case studies related to the slave rates selected so that they appealed to age-old topics of good versus bad governance and illustrated his central legal concerns. This central legal concern, contrary to the assumptions of modern scholars, was not the capture and sale of free Roman citizens, but issues those raids brought into sharp relief: the temporal status of person, conditione hominum temporali. This theme, personal status, that is, the social and legal status of a person at birth and its uncertainties, often brought in sharp relief as a consequence of the slave trade, is central to what follows. However, since Augustine went on to have a fairly significant impact on Western thought, I will conclude by bringing the theme of personal status briefly into dialogue with the theological concepts that occupied Augustine at that very moment when he wrote letters 10 and 24 in 427 or 428. The Augustinian concepts I have in mind regard divine grace, human free will, and original sin. And I will address them in the context of the slave trade and issues of uncertain personal status because Augustine did so himself. 427 and 428 are the dates now accepted for these letters rather than the earlier one of 422, and this redating has consequences for Augustine and the slave trade not yet fully probed. At that time, 427 or 8, Alypius, rather than traveling to a court he knew well and had successfully lobbied for legal action before, was en route to a new court in trouble. In 423, a new emperor had acceded to the throne in the West, Valentinian III. In 427 or 428, Valentinian was 8 years old, a child, who had recently arrived in Ravenna with his mother, Galla Placidia, who acted as a kind of regent in the West. Earlier, in 410, Galla Placidia, a daughter of Theodosius I, had been captured and enslaved by the Visigoths under Alaric, who sacked Rome. The Visigoths recognized her value and only released her 6 years later in exchange for settlement in Spain. In 427 or 428, Galla Placidia, now as regent, was again in a tenuous position, because her two leading military commanders were locked in a fatal battle for control of the court and the realm. One of them was the military leader of Africa, Boniface. Embroiled in deep struggles with his rival, Boniface sought the military support of the Vandals, who had moved into southern Spain. By 429, the Vandals crossed the Straits of Gibraltar. When Augustine died in 430, they were at the gates of Hippo Regius. However, while Augustine wrote letters 10 and 24, the crossing of the Vandals into Africa was still a year or two in the future. Nevertheless, they made their presence felt. Since their arrival in southern Spain in 425, they had disrupted the trade routes linking Africa to Constantinople and the West, forcing traders to move their wares to ports further east, such as Hippo Regius. Those wares included slaves. Whatever the tensions and turmoil in Ravenna and other parts of the Roman Empire, however, in those years, the Roman North African provinces, always prosperous and safe, experienced a veritable boom. Together with Egypt and Sicily, North Africa was the breadbasket of the empire. Extensive port facilities, of which Hippo Regius was the second largest, allowed the Roman imperial government, the greatest trader, to export the produce from vast imperial and aristocratic estates, supplies for the army, and the grain, olive oil, and other foodstuffs provided by the taxation in kind of Africa's lands and its inhabitants. By the time of Augustine, a significant portion of the estates producing these riches were owned by the church. Hippo Regius was the second largest episcopal see after Carthage. In 411, the estates Augustine controlled as bishop were 20 times the size of his parental estate, and in 414, as a result of his and Alypius' successful lobbying of the imperial court at Ravenna, this size nearly doubled. Compared to the estates of the super-rich, such holdings were comparatively modest, but they were not insignificant. In sum, while the Western Roman Emperor and his, or rather her, court at Ravenna felt the pressures of the disintegrating realm, the provinces of Africa remained the economic engine of the West. In fact, the prosperous, vast, and beautiful garden, the passing of which Michael Rostovtsev had mourned, was alive and well. Given this context, what caused Augustine such enormous concern? Letter 10, the private memorandum, falls into two parts, of which only the second addressed the slave raids and their effect. First, Augustine thanked Alypius for sending him the most recent book of a certain Julian of Eclanum, to which he was already responding. Only then did Augustine delve into the affairs at Hippo and the 120 Roman citizens captured to be sold overseas. In light of this outrage, Augustine instructed Alypius to get the court to amend a law already on the books, a copy of which he appended to his letter. This law we no longer possess, but it had been addressed to the governor of Africa and prescribed draconian punishments for merchants who sold mancipia, slaves, overseas. Augustine wanted the law to be expanded to punish also merchants who sold free persons, Roman citizens, overseas as slaves. This request makes no sense. The kidnapping, capture, and sale of free Roman citizens had always been a crime, plagium, with sufficiently draconic punishments firmly in place. No amendment was necessary. Likewise, it is not clear why the sale of slaves by traders overseas should be illegal. Slaves, after all, were by definition for sale. Hence, already these first sentences should alert us that this letter concerns neither the sale of free Roman citizens nor that of actual slaves. Those earlier scholars who noticed the conundrum explained it with Augustine's lacking comprehension of Roman law. Recent scholarship is unanimous in attesting Augustine instead a very high degree of legal competence. But Roman law is indeed at the root of the conundrum. As Nicholas Purcell has recently re-emphasized, societies are deeply formed by what it is they can sell and what is excluded from commercial transactions. In the Roman Empire, certain human beings were for sale, while others were inalienable. The dividing line was drawn at birth. Status at birth, unalterable by any other means, divided slave and free. By law, no freeborn person could be sold, sell himself or his freeborn children. Freeborn persons were inalienable forever. In this, all Roman legal theorists and all other authors to the time of Justinian, that is to the 6th century, concurred. All other human bodies were commodities for sale. Roman theorists, legal and otherwise, thus agreed that slavery was essentially a question of tough luck, a fact of birth, quite divorced from the merit of the human being concerned. Once born as a slave, one was utterly dependent on the master's whim, and whether the master was benevolent or cruel was independent of a slave's personal merit, though prompt obedience was always advisable. Such complete and utter dependence on another person's grace had repercussions. All agreed that, irrespective of birth, the condition of enslavement, even if temporary, for example, because of captivity in war, left an indelible mark, the macula servitutis. This stain of slavery was, however, not necessarily external. Hence, it is difficult to distinguish a free man from a slave. Difficile dignosci potest liber homo a servo. Because it left no visible marks, and this fact became even more difficult as a consequence of changes in the social status at birth, or origo. Thus, the picture of slavery in the later Roman Empire is highly complex. The clear positions of the Roman law, positing and preserving the deep divide between bodies as property and free human beings, was always confronted with a reality in which this divide was crossed and recrossed. Slaves could be wealthy and own slaves of their own. Freeborn persons could be sold and did sell themselves, or could become captives, imperial princesses included. Further, by the time of Augustine, as a consequence of changes in the tax law under Diocletian, which extended to concepts of origo to include the land, a great number of persons lived in a gray zone, in hybrid states, as neither true slaves nor really free. Among those were the persons for whom Augustine sought a change in imperial legislation, not least because incidents such as the slave raids brought into focus the dire consequences of such status uncertainty. The traders and their powerful patrons demanded that Augustine compensate them for merchandise they considered illegally seized in numbers that were not trivial. Hence, it was imperative for Augustine to clarify what exactly was at stake: kidnapping, theft, actual sales, something different. Augustine begins with a brief mention of the free Roman citizens to whom he returns at the end of his letter. Immediately thereafter, he states that among those now freed were veri servi, true slaves whose capture was illegal. They posed no problem, however, because if not sold by their owners, they were merely object of theft. Then he mentions children. 5 or 6 children who had been sold by their parents. Such transactions were legal. However, the traders do not buy these, as the Roman laws allow, for work lasting 25 years, but they buy them precisely as slaves and sell them overseas as slaves, ut servi. Augustine then alerts Alypius to a woman sold by her husband, even though she had no evident flaws. I always wonder what would have happened had she had evident flaws. The husband, who was quite well off, was a tenant or colonos of our church. After that, Augustine returned to the free persons captured from the rural estates, to which I will return. Augustine submitted the same cases in his second letter to the legal consultant. In sum, Augustine's letters focus on persons who fell into the gray zone in between, neither fully free nor truly enslaved. As far as the children were concerned, Augustine was fully aware that by law, freeborn children could not be sold. However, the sale of their labor for 25 years was permitted. This raised questions of dominion, ownership, and possession that required clarification. Who owned what and whose claim took precedence? The potestas of the father or that of the person who had bought the labor but not the child? Augustine was of the opinion that he who bought the labor of such a child had not acquired the rights inherent in the position of dominus or slave owner. Such rental or apprenticeship agreements did not diminish the father's potestas. His freeborn status remained intact. However, during the 25-year period during which the labor was rented out, these children were not free. They lived ut servi as slaves without being very servi, true slaves. Were they to be sold overseas, however, their status would change. They would be caught illegally in servitus perpetua. Displacement, not sale, changed their status as persons, not legally, but in fact. Second, the tenant, who sold his wife. Augustine's term is colonus of the church. Could a colonus of the church sell his wife, or, as Augustine asked in letter 24, his children? Or was that the prerogative of the owner of the land to which the colonus belonged? The answer was entirely open. If it was the right of the owner, then in what capacity? As possessor, owner of the land, or as dominus, owner of a slave? Augustine was not certain. Moreover, the colonus of letter 10, who sold his wife, belonged to the church. Who owned the estates of the church? Elsewhere, Augustine stated that the owner or dominus of everything was God, but that Augustine as bishop was God's procurator or top managerial slave, who supervised and indeed owned God's slaves. Thus, in fact, the dominus in question with regard to the colonus and his wife was Augustine. With this, Augustine returned again to the free-born Roman citizens whose capture had so enraged him. Though he does not say so explicitly when addressing Alypius, and recall that Augustine was shaping a legal argument for a court governed by an empress who had been a slave to herself as a free Roman citizen. These free-born Roman citizens were these very coloni or tenants. While technically free-born, as Augustine stressed, their status evidently hovered certainly in between. They were free, but not entirely, though not true slaves either. However, these were the men, women, and children whose brutally hard labor fed the empire. They filled the breadbaskets of Rome, and they did so also on estate owned by the church as its colony. Thus, they were directly under Augustine's control or under the control of procurators and others who controlled them on Augustine's behalf. And as Augustine makes crystal clear, their legal status was in limbo. This made them vulnerable precisely to events just as the one now preoccupying Augustine. Had they been truly freeborn, the traders would have committed plagio. Were they slaves, their sale overseas would be prohibited. The slaves in question in the law Augustine appended were agricultural slaves, mancipia originaria, bound for tax reasons to the land to which they were born, origo, and on which they produced the revenue, so that they could be sold only with the land and certainly not overseas. Hence the draconian punishments for traders selling such slaves. They participated in tax evasion. Legal clarification on the part of the emperor was hence crucial, and Augustine Alypius had every reason to demand it. Indeed, an earlier law addressed to Gaul described coloni as servi terrae, slaves of the land. But that law too skirted the issue. Though free, they were classified in analogy to slaves, something the law categorically prohibited. The legal status of a colonus or tenant bound to the land on which he was born or originated, coloni originarii, in the late 4th and early 5th century, in relation to that of true slaves bound to the land, is one of the dominant themes in the historiography of the later Roman Empire, because these persons were in a position the Roman law was not equipped to define. Slavery in Rome depended on the clear distinction in Roman law of property between the inalienable freeborn and those who were alienable because born as slaves. This stood in absolute tension with a reality in which numerous persons lived in a hybrid state, neither true slaves nor really free. Many of the best Roman minds grappled with this because the consequences were real. Among those in limbo were the men, women, and children whose labor fed the Roman Empire, and those engaged in the legal conundrum were the domini who owned them and the land to which they were bound through origo, parentage. Further, the gradations of unfreedom he addressed also led to gradations of freedom, which was not absolute. Such gradations on either end of the spectrum affect the nature of possession and ownership, that is, the power of the father, the possessor, and the dominus. If two legitimate powers have equal yet conflicting claims, who prevails? Augustine's letter 10 and 24, supported by other Augustinian writings, demonstrate that he as a bishop acted as judge in cases of uncertain personal status, deliberandi causae. These cases were reserved for the highest level of the Roman provincial judiciary. He also acted in defense of his property, which included colony. His and Alypius' entreaties to the court, asking for legal clarification, further demonstrate the procedural character of the late Roman Empire. Legal, social, economic, and administrative changes occurred as a process in intense negotiation from the bottom up, more often than from the top down, instigated by the practitioners. Bishops, as estate managers, as domini, and judges were among those practitioners. Other possessors and domini, including the patrons who sponsored, protected, and profited from the activities of the slave traders and their catchers, were the bishops' peers, as well as members of their congregations. These congregations, as Augustine states elsewhere, included slave traders and catchers, coloni with their wives and children, and true slaves. What are the implications of these two letters? Above and beyond that, we can extract by reading them carefully. And more to the point, what do they have to do with paradise lost or questions of earthly and heavenly citizenship? First, it is important to keep in mind that slavery in the Roman Empire and in the Christian Roman Empire was legal. And that means it was legal for Christians as well. On that basis, we can begin to take Augustine on slavery seriously. When Augustine speaks about slavery in the context of other than letter 10, what did he actually say? What was self-understood in a society in which slavery was legal and a day-to-day reality? As I hope to have shown, nothing in letter 10 and 24 regarding slavery as an earthly social practice was metaphorical. For all their rhetorical aspects, these two letters address social, economic, and legal realia, with the exception of the final salutation of this letter, where Augustine greets Alypius as his conservus. All translations render this as servant. Does it do justice to Augustine? I think not. Augustine greeted Alypius as his fellow slave, spoke of himself as procurator or managerial slave of God, or as episcopus servus servorum Dei, bishop and slave of God's slave, and of God as dominus, slave owner. Augustine, in this one letter, and in nearly all his writings, moves seamlessly between actual and metaphorical slavery, because these are the metaphors he and his audience lived by. And they knew very well that a slave was not always a true slave, and a freeborn person was not always truly free, but heavily constrained through his or her origo or origin. What then about Augustine's concurrent thoughts about grace, will, and sin that caused so much outrage among some of his contemporaries? To recall, Augustine opened letter 10 to Alypius by confirming that he had received books by a certain Julian of Eclanum. Alypius had sent him, and that he was already rebutting Julian. The work in question is the incomplete work against Julian, in which Augustine presented the most mature and reasoned account of his position on divine grace, human free will, and original sin, peccatum originale, though his views on these matters had evolved over the years in intense debates with his rivals, above all Pelagius and Julian of Eclanum. At stake was the nature of Adam's first sin, the precise reason of his fall, and the implications and consequences for that sin for the nature of man. All agreed that man, much like Adam in paradise, had been created free and endowed with a free will. But what happened at the moment of post-lapsarian birth? This was a vital question, leading Elizabeth Clark to observe, I doubt that at any time before or after the first 3 decades of the 5th century were a group of celibate men so concerned with babies. Clark is not certain whether they were discussing babies in theory or flesh and blood babies, but I would argue that they were of flesh and blood. However, at stake, I argue, was not the act of birth per se, natus, but its social, legal, and economic aspects and their theological and anthropological implications. The technical term summarizing the social, legal, and economic aspects of parentage is origo. More to the point, the person who made that decisive shift to focus on those aspects, on origo, rather than on natural birth, natus, had been Augustine, as Julian of Eclanum had seen very clearly. Augustine, he says, under the impact of Manichaeism, had substituted origo for natus when speaking of man's sin at birth, origo. To recall, what defined the boundary between slave and free in the Roman Empire was status at birth, origo. Status at birth not only separated slaves and free, but determined everyone's legal, social, and economic status by encapsulating each person's obligations and privileges, from the nature of citizenship to the right to marry. Origo had always been essential, but it became more so as a result of Diocletian's new taxation system, which led to an increased link between origo and tax liability. Through birth, everyone, whether curialis or tenant, was bound to a particular tax bracket. Thus, a colonus was technically born free, but bound by obligations to land on which he was born, such that he became a slave to that land, sold to the land through origo. At the same time, as my earlier discussion has shown, these legal and economic categories shifted according to circumstance and experience. Origo, though seemingly inflexible, was not in fact utterly fixed. One could be born free, yet bound as if one was a slave, so that both freedom and bondage were linked by a vast gray area in between. Neither freedom nor slavery were thus absolutes, and more importantly, there were not polar opposites in fact, as which we have received them post-Luther and post-slavery and enlightenment, abolition and enlightenment. I think that Augustine was fully aware of these complexities, of the instability of notions of freedom and bondage as implicit in the concept of origo, status at birth, parentage, when he developed his mature notions of sin through origo, original sin, on a theological level. In other words, when making his theological arguments about sin through origo, I suggest, he was approaching them in a way that paralleled the problems of freedom and bondage he encountered with actual status, evident in these 2 letters, reflecting a complex interplay of birth, status, bad luck. What Augustine explored theologically in his work against Julian, as well in his De Civitate Dei, completed in 426, was the same modified, perilous sense of origo, freedom, and bondage in human nature. Like the majority of his contemporary ecclesiastical leaders, Augustine too had initially been of the opinion that man was created free and born free from sin, but then accumulated sin through the remainder of his life. Concurrent with his return to Africa and the beginning of his episcopate, Augustine's views began to change. Prompted by a public debate with a highly educated Manichaean Christian leader over the interpretation of Paul's letter to the Romans, Augustine began to reconsider slowly but surely his ideas about the nature of man, his dependence on God, obedience, and the freedom of the will. His earlier Plato and Stoa-inspired confidence in man's rationality and self-reliance, his innate freedom, increasingly gave way to the notion that man was born with a free will, but through birth, origo, bound to sin. He posited a notion of man as powerless and utterly dependent on the arbitrary grace of an omnipotent divine master or dominus, whose grace operated entirely without regard to man's individual merit. Augustine no longer held that man was born free and only subsequently enslaved to a sinful body, as most of his contemporaries thought, and as he had once thought himself, but insisted that man, though endowed with free will, was bound to sin through his origo, obligations he had inherited from Adam's first act of disobedience, the peccatum originale. After all, from whom and where would Christ have repurchased us if we had not been sold to sin through origo? Augustine too insisted upon the redemptive nature of divine grace. But as I have shown, whether one was born enslaved and depended utterly on the mysterious operation of a divine grace, or received such grace as a result of the merit of one's inborn free will, as Augustine's opponents such as Pelagius and Julian thought, made a real difference in a world that held born free and born slaved absolutely incommensurable, a world in which origo was central. At the outset, Augustine's views changed because a challenge by the Manichaean Fortunatus prompted him to read Paul's letters in a new way. For Fortunatus, Paul's declaration in Romans that man's soul is captive through the law of sin that is in his mortal limbs meant that though the human soul and will are linked to God and the good, they are constantly taken captive and enslaved by an oppressing, materially existing evil. For a Manichaean interpretation based on the opposition of two nearly equally powerful masters, the enslavement of man's soul from his birth into coercive physical servitude that the soul, which is with its will constantly resisted, was part of an epic battle of good versus evil, and hence positively connoted. For Augustine, we had to defend one God and said both that God's goodness and his omnipotence, the challenge was much greater, especially if he took the existence of evil seriously, and that he did. Thus, Augustine began to argue that man was through birth, origo, enslaved to sin. However, responsible for that enslavement was not the body, not the nature of the body as the opposing other, but rather the soul itself through the collective legacy of Adam's fall. The body was enslaved to the soul, but the soul, when it sinned, enslaved itself. Sin was the disobedience of the soul and the will against its own nature and its own commandments. Thus, all human beings, though free in their will, were also born enslaved to sin in their very own will, neither a true slave nor entirely free. Hence, the soul could be saved only if it voluntarily submitted to obedience to God. Only the act of will leading to surrender truly freed. For that to occur, however, divine grace was necessary. And such grace God granted arbitrarily, as a dominus could and should. Individual merit had little to do with it. Phrased differently, for Augustine, parentage, origo in the theological sense, is as mixed and complex as it is in the social sense. because man and man's will is absolutely born free in the image of God, yet enslaved through the inherited sin of Adam. As in the new Roman laws concerning coloni originarii, both are true at the same time. One can be free and bound at the same time, even though that is confusing and indeed in conflict with strict interpretations of the law. Paul also had made that point: the good I want to do, I cannot do. The contradictions and complexities of that observation became even more pressing, I think, to a man such as Augustine, who was increasingly confronted by the muddled middle ground of social and economic realities, also reflected in the Roman law of Origo, ever more muddled as a result of Diocletian's tax laws. These realities created a conceptual space for Augustine to rethink the philosophical arguments about freedom and bondage in relation to his actual experiences as a theologian and bishop, where human self-determination was far more complex and frail than earlier and contemporary defenders of Christian self-determinism wished to acknowledge and hence explore. Augustine never denied that man was born free regardless of his opponent's claims, but he held that this freedom was compromised because man had been sold through his origo, itself compromised by the sin of Adam, to sin. Freedom was relative and no longer guaranteed by origo alone, but relied on the grace of a dominus who might restore what was lost in enslavement by sin. I certainly do not want to offer monocausal explanations for Augustine's notions of divine will, grace, and original sin. I have just sketched in the briefest possible fashion. Rather, I want to suggest that Augustine refined and elaborated these concepts over and against competing ideas, now associated with the name Pelagius and Julian of Eclanum, not only as theoretical concepts. I think that Augustine, the bishop, estate manager, advocate, judge, pastor, member of the late Roman elites, intensely engaged with the different realities of freedom and dependence in Roman North Africa, offers in his theological concepts of sin through origo, will and grace, his reflections of these realities. If so, then Augustine's engagement with this world, the civitas terrena of the Roman Empire, was more direct than has been argued, because like Michael Rostovtsev so many centuries later, Augustine too used the language of social status, taxation, and the economy to describe and analyze the civitas in which he then lived, Roman North Africa, to formulate ways in which we might rejoin the ideal city from which we all have been expelled, the civitas Dei. Thank you very much.